Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the People's Choice Podcast. And I'm here with a very special guest. I'm here with Andrew Pledger. This guy is an amazing man who is willing to come on my platform and share his amazing life, his amazing story. Not so amazing because he went through a lot, but as far as, just being open about it and wanting to encourage people, talk about the crazy things that he's been through in his life, from being a part of this religious cult to breaking away from it, to bringing awareness to, not just, for my audience, but whoever may see this, my new audience as well. So please welcome him on the show, Andrew.
Yes, thank you so much for having me on. I'm excited for this opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. I'm so I'm so honored to have you on here and just to hear, your story and go more like a diver deep, because the research I was doing on you is just crazy to think that, and sometimes people don't really think we're just going through like our own life and but to think that there's people here that has faced some traumatic trauma, and with you, from my research, it started at a very early age, basically your whole life growing up in the church and put on those beliefs and things. So I'll let you the floor is yours. I'll let you do introduction, and we'll start from there.
Yes, awesome. So for people who don't know me, my name is Andrew Pledger, and I grew up in a fundamentalist Christian cult, and specifically the IFB cult. And like, for people who don't know what that means, the IFB is the Independent Fundamental Baptist Movement in Fundamentalist Christianity. And it's not as it's gotten more attention in the last few years with people coming forward with their stories. There's another podcast that specifically sheds light on IFB abuse. It's called Preacher Boys. If anyone's interested in learning more about the IFB movement and the history behind that. And yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in the IFB cult. I was born into it. I was homeschooled my entire life for the purpose of being indoctrinated into this religious cult, and really keeping it in the family and passing it down. And the thing about the IFB, and it's interesting because people who are currently in a cult never think they're a part of a cult because of the indoctrination. So I've gotten backlash from people who be like, that's not true, that's not a cult. And it's usually people who are still in it. And it really took me a while to realize that I grew up in a cult. It wasn't until I got out of it and then I started digging into cult education. And for people who aren't familiar, there were a couple of cult experts who have criteria that you can really apply to any. It doesn't have to be religious, but any group that you're in, whether it's a political cult or a spiritual cult or religious cult. And this system is called Lifton's Criteria for Thought Reform. And then Stephen Hassan, he came along, he's a cult expert, and he really simplified Lifton's criteria a little bit because there are a lot of different things involved. So we try to condense it more. But Stephen Hassan's BITE model, that's what it's called. It analyzes behavior, information, thought, and emotional. And those are all the aspects of control. So once I really applied Stephen Hassan's BITE model, understanding all the behavior control, all the information, the thought control, all the areas of control that this movement had over my life. And I really saw it. I was like, oh my gosh, this was really a cult. And I think that happens for a lot of people who grew up in cults and leave it because that's your only frame of reality. You don't have anything else to compare it to. So that's your normal. You think that's normal because that's all that you know. And so it's interesting because it wasn't until this year that I was able to admit and realize that I grew up in a cult, which is really kind of a hard thing to realize, and kind of like grieving grieving process of realizing of how abusive this environment really was. And I think, children who grew up in that kind of environment, it's sadly abuse is so normalized that it takes years later to realize that. And, it's interesting how this movement has kind of passed on in my family, because originally, like, my mom, she grew up Methodist. But someone within the IFB converted her family to fundamentalist Christianity. And my mom's mom, she just really, really got into it a lot. Like, it just, every part of her life was just, it had to do with the IFB cults. It just took everything, and she's still heavily involved in it. And she passed that passion, to her children. And so on my mom's side, a lot of them are teaching, or preachers, or in the ministry in the IFB cult. And it's been interesting to see that. And especially as me and cousins in my family, as we've left it, a lot of us have left the IFB cult, and there's obviously been a lot of conflict around that.
That was actually one of my first questions. I was going to ask, or were you the only one who broke away from it from your family?
Yeah, it's interesting because when people in my family did break away from it, I don't really think they had the capacity to know what they were dealing with. They didn't really talk about it openly. They just left. And thankfully, like, my family, none of us have we've only cut off, I haven't, but they have cut off one person from our family who did leave and was very vocal about their sexual identity and their queerness. And because of that, a lot of my family is like, we have to cut this person off. We can't associate with them anymore, which is really sad to see. Really, also as a queer person in the closet, seeing that happen was very emotionally disturbing and hard to grapple with. And really, I couldn't speak up about that. And I think, thankfully, my own parents, they've seen so many people push away their children or their family because they left, and they've seen the harm of relationships. I think that's what really stopped them from wanting to do that, because I very publicly left the IFB cult. It wasn't quiet at all.
Yeah, I've seen, on multiple different podcasts and platforms and sharing your story, and I was like, man, you are super brave for doing that. And like I said, just reading up on you and just seeing, the trauma that you faced. And I know you're saying you're part of the LGBT plus community.
Yeah.
And he was actually quoted when I was looking you up. I actually got right here where you were saying that the damaging was like, sorry, here it is. I lost my train. The damaging was hateful, like from the on the LGBTQ plus community. It was like the church painted an ugly picture by describing and generalizing gay people as all perverts and going around raping people and hurting children. And that was like, wow, because I have a gay uncle. One of my best friends is gay. And just to know that there's churches or this cult that putting that message out there is just so like hurtful and so wrong. Like, you dive in deeper into just some of the things that they were instilling into you, because for you to come out like say, hey, I'm part of this community and I don't believe in that, like, that's really good. And I want to applaud you for that, because
thank you.
It takes a lot of bravery. What was the other stuff like they were saying that to brainwash you, basically?
Yeah, so from a very young age, I was brainwashed into this cult, and things that we were taught. Really, a big part of the IFB is that they break your will, which, for people who don't know what that means, is they really destroy your desire to have autonomy. or to have any desire to pursue what's best for you. So they break your will. They make you so dependent on them to push their agenda, and they claim that it's what God wants you to do. That's what they say. They break your will and really use a lot of psychological abuse, and using fear and shame to control people, and specific messages, but that they instilled, which, I remember really my first memory was probably around 5 years old, was just being in a Sunday school class at the cult. And just there would be pictures that teachers would show us of people burning in hell, and them telling us this is what would happen to us if we did not conform to the religion. And they called it the plan of salvation, I think is what they called it, and how like you have to basically it's this prayer that you say, that you ask Jesus into your heart, and once you do that, you're saved, and you're saved from hell. But the thing is, though, if you they try to tell you that you're secure in your salvation or your security of going to heaven, but they tell you that if you don't conform to the group, that's probably a sign that you might not be saved, that it might not have actually really happened, you might actually still be going to hell. So there was a lot at stake if you didn't conform to the group and didn't agree with anything. So you really had to conform to deal with that fear of going to hell. And really sadly, in order to convince people that you deserve to go to hell, they basically completely devalue you. They tell you you are so worthless and God sees you as nasty and disgusting, basically. And that you don't deserve anything good. And if any, be grateful for the good that happens to you, because you deserve everything bad and everything awful to happen to you. And so, and really looking back on that, it's very understandable why a lot of abuse thrives in churches, because when you hear these messages, when bad things happen or abuse happens to victims, there's this internalized message that you are worthless and that you deserved the most awful torture anyways. So that's this kind of messaging and beliefs silences a lot of victims in these very abusive church environments. And so hearing those messages over and over again, it wasn't until I think I was 8 years old that it was after a sermon at church. It was just this guest preacher at the cult that I grew up in. He just told the most graphic, horrific sermon on hell, just talking and describing all these different demons and how you would be tortured forever, and all these different demons would just basically like ripping you apart, tearing you, and like it was just all these terrible, graphic, awful things. And so I remember that night after church, just not being able to sleep and being so scared of going to hell and having nightmares of hell and all these terrible things that have been just ingrained in me. And I remember that one night that my mom came in and asked what was wrong, and I told her I was scared of going to hell. And that's when she really showed or gave me the cult's formula of how to feel secure in heaven. And so, just praying that prayer of that accepting Jesus and then you're saved. It was interesting because there was a lot of contradicting messages in the church, because we were told that, in a sense, that we had worth because we were made in the image of God. But then again, they were constantly devaluing us all the time. So there was just a lot of contradictory messaging. And it was interesting because what I saw and what is really common in cults is that they have this us versus them mindset. People who are outside the belief system are demonized, and those are the inside are the good ones, the ones that are saved, the ones on the right path. It's very us versus them. And so there are different interpretations of Christianity, and I just want to let people know that, and that this is just the interpretation that I grew up in. And sadly, people who were not conformed to their religion, they did not have worth. God did not, it doesn't make sense, honestly, but until they would get saved, God wouldn't really accept them. Like, it was interesting because God still loved them, but he would still burn them or still have this hatred for them, really, and still want to turn them to hell. But he wanted that opportunity to save them. And so people on the outside were seen as children and really servants of Satan, which, you know, for people who aren't familiar with Christianity, Satan is like the bad guy in the Bible who caused the fall in the garden and all that in that mythological story of creation, and is supposedly going across all the earth with his demons, tempting people and trying to basically get people in hell. And that's what I really noticed, and that's what really bothered me internally, because that just wasn't natural to me to really demonize people who were different. This cult really valued sameness. It did not value diversity. And really this kind of mindset is very, you know, as I've gotten out and deconstructed, it's very rooted in like white supremacy, really, is when I look back on it and see all these different things. And like, you know, the church was also all white people too. There was no person of color in the church of all, which I really noticed. And looking back, there were some things that I'm shocked that people accepted, because the church had a bus ministry and it was very segregated. It was people of color who would come in the bus ministry. They would be in another building, and the white people would be in another building. They didn't call it segregation, but that's what it really was. And looking back at how they really separated those groups of people, and even though obviously I didn't hear terrible messages of people of color, but like noticing the behavior of, like, you know, we learn a lot through behavior. So noticing how we separated, it really caused me to be scared of people who are different than me, honestly, growing up, because that communicated that we shouldn't be around people who are different than us. And, you know, other things that did go on in this church, there were moments of racism, sadly, but it was painted as good. Fundamentalists are very anti-Semitic. They teach you, this is what I heard a lot, Jews are basically going to hell, practicing Jews. That's what I was taught a lot, because they did not accept the New Testament. So basically everyone outside the belief system anyways was condemned to hell. And other teachings that were really harmful was just this idea that your heart is wicked, you can't trust yourself, you can't trust your thoughts, Satan can influence you. So it's really, and another thing about cults is that they really make you dependent on the cult and make you distrust yourself. They give you a new identity and they cut you off from yourself, really. And that's what I noticed looking back of how there's so much self-annihilation, really. And like there was so many toxic messages on sexuality and how it had to fit this very heteronormative standard. And like that was very harmful to me, because I did not fit their standard of what they thought was the best. And, you know, hearing again and again every Sunday, and a lot of the times how really God, you know, supposedly destroyed these cities because these people had a certain sexuality, and that he had said that they were an abomination. So to grow up and really believing in this God and realizing that, oh my gosh, like this God really hates me and wants to destroy me, and just living, I really lived in a state of hypervigilance, always afraid what would happen, because, you know, if you sin, you're punished, but if you're righteous, then God would test you and do terrible things. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It didn't make sense how on both sides you were going to suffer no matter what. So it just didn't make sense to me. I was like, because like kind of like this story of Job, of how he was this supposedly righteous man and God did all these terrible things. So that really caused me to be scared, because I believed that my parents were very righteous, and that because of that, God was gonna hurt my family or test us. And you know, I'm just using kind of the language that they would use in this. And also the system is very patriarchal. Women aren't supposed to have higher leadership positions, really aren't supposed to speak. Like, of course they can like cook, teach classes, and do these, you know, gender stereotypical things, but women weren't really allowed to speak in the pulpit or like in the auditorium of the church. And so I think, at the core of it, what is so abusive is just this constant devaluing of your humanity and who you are as a person. Just hearing that over and over again, and all this fear and shame that is used to control, and just all the different psychological abuse. And one of the most psychologically abusive things I remember hearing was really the pressure that was put on us to try to save people. And what saving people meant was that we had to share the gospel of the plan of salvation from the Bible with people to get people saved. And, we were told, and, even when I was a child, that I could be the reason that someone burns for eternity if I decide not to share the gospel. So there's this,
Wow.
so imagine that on a child's mind.
You were like, what, 8 years old?
Yes.
Like, my goodness.
So all these psychologically, emotionally, spiritually abusive messages, and that's just like a gist of a lot of the things and messages that you hear.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's just tip of the iceberg from the stuff I was like researching on you, and it's just crazy that that happened to you from 8 to basically as an adult, and I'm glad that you're able to escape from that that cult and realize that what they're saying is like completely wrong, and the things they're doing. Like, do you remember the exact moment or day when you were like, enough's enough, I'm done with this, I'm leaving? Like, can you walk through the whole process was, and how'd your family take it in?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, it took me a long time to even question that system, because I was heavily indoctrinated because, I was born into it. I was homeschooled. It was my whole world. But I suffered a lot with mental health in my teen years, and in the IFB, mental health symptoms, that means that it is your fault, that you're not praying enough, you're not spiritual enough, or that you're being attacked by demons. The IFB does not recognize psychology as legitimate. It's actually very demonized. I've heard several, even like in Sunday school, of people saying that psychology is bull crap. You don't need any of that stuff. Just read your Bible and pray. That's all we need. And sadly, that's just so inaccurate and not true, because psychological help was what I really needed, and thankfully I was able to get once I left. But I suffered a lot with major depression, and I wasn't really sure at the core of it specifically. I knew certain reasons. I knew part of it. I'm like, okay, these messages, like the internalized homophobia, was something I realized at like 16 was a lot of my depression. There were other things, but it was a mix of repressing emotions, repressing my sexuality, repressing trauma and not processing trauma, and also dealing with not knowing that, really struggling with also developmental trauma and religious trauma. But developmental trauma, which I didn't learn about this until 2021, which is just really, I didn't realize it was something that was possible until I learned about it. But you can become traumatized from things that don't happen, that you need psychologically and emotionally as a child. It can cause a lot of long-term mental health effects from psychological and emotional needs and relationships that do not form or don't happen in those developing years. And that was something that it was hard to deal with and dig into developmental psychology and learn about things that I needed growing up that I did not get. Understanding that I didn't truly belong in any environment. I wasn't seen or heard or understood. My life was surrounded by people with conditional love. It wasn't unconditional. I had to conform to a certain standard to be loved. I wasn't loved for who I was, because I was taught who I was completely wicked and depraved as a person. And so getting to the point to undo that, or begin even questioning or even thinking about walking away. And the thing is, cults they do this thing. It's called phobia indoctrination. And phobia indoctrination is when the fear of leaving the cult is so much greater than staying in it. It doesn't matter how bad the inside gets, the outside is always going to seem so much worse. And really, how they keep people in the cult through phobia indoctrination. I heard a lot of sermons like, if you leave this belief system or this environment, you will fall into homelessness, you will fall into drugs, you will have no purpose, you will fall into depression, and all these terrible things will happen. And it's interesting because part of it was kind of true, because when you're in a cult, they take your identity and they give you an identity. So when you do leave the cult without forming your own identity, you will definitely be depressed and you will feel worthless and you will feel all these things. And it's not because that the cult had the answer. It's because the cult made you dependent on them. They indoctrinated you. They created a psychological hold on you, and it's hard. It's addictive to you, even though it's very harmful. And so in order to leave, you have to undo that indoctrination. You have to learn and to really grow as a person and form your own identity, which is really what I had to do to healthily leave, and not really fall into that state of despair because I didn't have my own identity because they took it from me. And how that process worked out was that I slowly in my teen years began kind of like questioning some of the teachings, because what really caused the first moment for me was the cognitive dissonance, when I realized that my experience with my sexuality didn't match what they taught. So I was like, oh my gosh, like this isn't true. So like, what else is not true? Because that forced me to question that, because my experience hadn't matched what they were saying. And even with mental health, my own experience didn't match what they were saying. I was doing all the things they were telling me to do, and my mental health was not getting better. And so that really, it was a slow process of, I mean, it really happened at 17 more because I didn't have internet access till I was 17 years old. So I had no idea of like anything that was going on in the world at all, really, so it's just really, it's been quite a culture shock.
That just adds even more to like your braveness, because they literally like controlled you from a young age of 8 to your teenage years of 17. So for you to realize and tap in deep inside your heart, knowing this isn't right, I don't want to be a part of this, like that's big, man. And I know you're gonna like inspire many people, not just that's in a cult that's looking to get out, but also people that never even knew about like the stuff that's going on with the IFB and just other cults that's like them, So, big praises for you, man, for real, for definitely, being brave.
Thank you.
You're welcome, man. Just because I couldn't imagine being in that position, because the fear of just how they're instilling that, and just how they're controlling you, and then on top of that, you're dealing with your own mental illness and depression and questioning sexuality. And I wanted to ask you about, because I was reading more about you, that a man that a lot of people looked up to named Bobby Robertson.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about him? And I read some stuff and I was like, oh, but if you want to discuss him and how people look at him almost like he's Jesus.
So it's interesting because when you're in a cult, there are times when you will experience red flags, but you do not know you don't have the language yet to understand what you're experiencing, but there's an alarm going off inside of you. And looking back, the first time I realized the really cult-like obsession that people had with my pastor was when a church member got onto the stage in front of the entire auditorium. And this was at a special service that my cult, we would do every single year. And it was the same exact thing. It would just be going over the history of the church, or really the cults, and how we've grown and all the different things that have happened. And they would claim that God did this. But the thing is, none of those things could have happened without all the people they converted and got to the cult, and all the money that they took from people to build all these buildings and to create this just massive church. I mean, at one time, I grew up in Gospel Light Baptist Church in Walkertown, North Carolina. It was one of the larger IFB churches in America. And people in the IFB called Brother Bobby, I know, America's pastor. That's what kind of he was referred to in those circles, at least. And, just to let people know, there were never any scandals with Brother Bobby of sexual abuse, but sadly, because of how he was trained, he did preach a lot of psychologically and spiritually abusive sermons just to everyone. And I think that's something that I've recognized, that as I've left, I'm like, okay, like a lot of those sermons and things that was very spiritually and psychologically abusive, and there's a lot of manipulation. But when I realized the obsession was when someone was praying on this stage in front of the auditorium, in front of all the cult members, and this person is praying to Jesus, and this person is praying to Jesus, and they're praying, "Dear Jesus, please help us to be more like Brother Bobby." And like when that happened, that just totally because that went against what they taught us. They always taught us to be more like Jesus. They tried to, at least.
I was just gonna say, yeah.
And so I was like, what? I'm like, why are we praying to God to be more like this man, this pastor in our church? And like, I was looking around, like people were just nodding their heads like they were agreeing. And I was like, oh my gosh, like it was just, I could feel like the hairs on my neck just going up and like the goosebumps. I'm like, this is just really, looking back, I'm like, that was very cultic, but I didn't know how to label that when I was experiencing it. It was just really weird to me and just set that off. And I was like, and like the obsession too that my parents would have or had, or really still have with him. But, Brother Bobby, he passed away in 2018, which quite honestly, when it happened, I was honestly very relieved when he died. Just because of the obsession that people had with him, and I got really tired of the control that he had over my parents, and that was something that my parents didn't like, because I didn't understand on their level of why they were so obsessed and looked up to him so much. And there were times my parents would talk about him, and they would sometimes they would almost cry, and sometimes they would cry when they would talk about him. Like he was just almost like he was God himself. And I'm just standing there because I'm questioning. I'm like, I don't understand why you're so obsessed, like why you love him so much. And they would get so offended by that. Like I was a terrible person for not adoring Brother Bobby.
Well, I was gonna ask us from the research of you that you're basically your parents' miracle baby, because I read that your parents had a bunch of miscarriages, and I was gonna wonder, like, maybe Pastor Bobby was maybe in their life around that time, their darkest moments, and probably kept them encouraged, and maybe that's why when you were conceived and born, maybe that's why they looked at him as such a highlight, maybe. And
yeah, I mean, my parents did not have any miscarriages that I'm aware of. They tried to have children for 7 years.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
They tried to. No,
yeah.
It's fine. I mean, my parents don't tell a lot about their past, so that might have happened. But as of I know, I don't know of any of that. But for 6 to 7 years, they just didn't have any children at all, and so that was very discouraging to them. And then all of a sudden, before they know it, after 7 years, they had my oldest brother in the late 90s, and then they had me in 2000, and then they had my younger brother in 2003. So after years of just not having children, then finally, it really meant a lot to them. And they saw it as like an answer to prayer from God, and that made them want. And I think really what happens in these environments when parents struggle to have children, and they believe that God has control over that or does that, they really pray that. And and this is in the Bible too. You see this these stories of like parents praying that, oh, if you give me this child, I will dedicate it to you. I will make sure I will raise it in this religion and dedicate their life to you. And growing up, there was a lot of pressure to stay in the cult and to really commit my entire life to it, because and really just be the person that my parents wanted, really, because they never said it, but just hearing them talk about the past, I knew that they had prayed that they would dedicate their children to their God. And in the IFB cult, there are these really creepy ceremonies that happen when a new baby is born, which I grew up in a church with people who were like 70 years old and over. Most of them were. So, like, obviously, there were no babies, a lot of babies happening, but like, towards my college years when I would go home, we started visiting different IFB churches out of curiosity. And we went to an IFB church that had a lot younger crowd, and I think it's called like dedicating or something. But anyways, it's a ceremony where the parents come in with their baby, and in front of the entire cult, they're like holding up this baby and having the pastor basically blessing it, praying over it, and saying that, basically praying that the baby will conform to the group, basically, and continue the tradition of the cult. And it's just really creepy to see, because I witnessed it, that I remember one time when I was around like 20, and there's this baby just crying its eyes out while he's being held up, like it's the Lion King or whatever. And like it's this big special moment, and the people are like praying over it, and the pastor is like has his microphone, speakers are loud. It's a very awful situation for a baby to be in, as being very sensitive to that kind of stimuli. And so I'm standing there, like, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is so creepy and so culty. And like I see my parents like, oh yes, I guess the pastor is saying all these things, dedicating the baby to God. And I'm like, this baby is not having a say in any of this. This baby is born into this situation, and y'all are just giving it its own destiny and deciding what its life is going to be like, because y'all believe, this cultic belief that your way is the only way and the only right way, and everyone else is wrong. So looking at that context and understanding how my parents raised me, and it makes a lot of sense that they would believe that. And so, I was homeschooled for the purpose of indoctrination. The Bible was a big part of my school curriculum. Learning Bible verses and digging and really learning, or being indoctrinated into fundamentalist theology, really. And specifically, a lot of people who are homeschooled either use Bill Gothard's homeschool curriculum, which is a whole other cult itself, which for some reason my parents never used that. They use what people also recognize as a Becca curriculum, which is it's a fundamentalist Christian school curriculum that pushes their worldview and their agenda. And basically it teaches that evolution is completely false, and that God created the world in like 6 days, and that the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. So it teaches you the Bible is actual fact, and that anything in science that contradicts anything in the Bible is false, basically, that the Bible is an absolute standard of truth. So there's that educational neglect, really, with that kind of approach to it, of using the Bible to indoctrinate. And so, there was so much pressure to be a good Christian, which meant reading your Bible every day, praying every day, being happy and glad about going to church. And, we went to church whenever the doors were open. So we went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and we also went to church on Wednesday night. And it really sucked when my cults would have revival, because that was a week. You would go to church every single night. And which is really hard, and I always hated those. But growing up, I was also in the cults. They had this Bible club called Masters Club, which just sounds really creepy, but Masters Club. But the purpose of it was like serving God, your master. And the best way I can describe for people who've never heard of this kind of Bible club, it's like Girl Scouts / Boy Scouts for Christian young people, basically. You had to do all these, really a lot of Bible memorization, and learning the Bible to earn different badges that would be like put on a vest. And there was so much pressure to really earn every single badge in this book, because my brother was greatly encouraged to do that, and pressure, because our parents were very hands-on with us, because outside of church we would be working through this book at home. We're really forced to. And this Bible club that was, I think it's international, I know it's national at least, but they would have competitions across the US, and one of the competitions was at my church. And it would be another way to reinforce that indoctrination of competing in different Bible games. So like, I can't name, I'm not going to name all of them because that would take forever, but one of the Bible games is called Bible Sequence, and you would have to lay down cards with pictures and names of the Bible stories in the right sequence, and it would be books of the Bible in the right sequence also in certain games. So that's just a little gist. So it was just this constant indoctrination and pressure to just learn the Bible so well. And I remember feeling the pressure to do a great job in Master Club, and I probably ended up earning over 100 badges those few years. And that is like, I have a big ass vest full of all these badges from it, and like, it's I don't know, I'm not sure where it is. It's probably still at my parents' house right now. I've been curious to like look at it again and all the different things that I had to do. But really digging into that, my life wasn't really my own. It was what my parents wanted. And so, and I think from a young age, I realized that I could never truly be loved for who I was. It was only for what I did. So the more I conformed to this group, the more I acted happy, or more I tried to get more badges or show that I wanted to become a better Christian, or in their eyes, the more I would be loved and accepted. So the fawn response, or the people pleasing response, was a big part of my trauma response, of just completely denying my needs and completely pleasing my parents no matter what, and ignoring anything that was really going on in my life and repressing it. And as I got older and older, I realized that the control would not stop when I graduated high school from homeschooling, because if me and my brothers, if we wanted to go to college, we could only go to a Christian college. And so they would only pay for that. And the struggle is that a lot of Christian colleges, especially fundamentalist Christian colleges, they are not accredited, which means their degrees aren't worth anything. So that means if you go to school there, you can only get hired within the belief system or within the cult. And so that's another way of them to keep you in their system, that they're the only ones that can really hire you.
And I didn't even know that. Wow, that's
yes, yes. So a lot of colleges that really came to my cult to advertise, all of them, they weren't accredited at all. They were like Bible colleges where you could just basically forced to be in the ministry. And that's another thing about the IFB cult, is that it really tries to coerce people into being in the ministry full time. They try to convince you that your purpose, the reason you're born here, is to be full-time ministry in the IFB, to push their agenda. And I heard several shameful sermons about, if you're not committing your life to the IFB or to the full-time ministry, then you're not doing the right thing, or you're not listening to God. And it was interesting because my parents always went along with everything they said, but that was the one thing they disagreed with, which really surprised me. And looking back, I realized why. And it was because my parents both went to a Christian college. My dad studied to be a pastor. He became a pastor. He was a full-time minister. He was a preacher for several years before I was born. But because he was coerced into that, and it really wasn't right for him, he had to experience the consequences of being coerced into doing that. And I think that's what kind of made my parents open their eyes, because they sadly had to deal with the consequences of following that path that was given to them. And so my parents they still tried to agree with the cult, but kind of making it on their own. And they always told me and my brothers growing up, we want you to, do what you're passionate about, but they're like, we want you to be full-time Christians. So, and we want you to be Sunday school teachers at least. when you grow up. So there is still that pressure to stay in a system, to read the Bible every day.
Like, I want you to spread your wings and do what you love, but I also want you to do, you know?
Yeah. And so, yeah, there was so much pressure to conform to that and really like not be my own person. And so eventually the Christian college that I ended up at was Bob Jones University. And by the time I was at Bob Jones University, and like for people who don't know what Bob Jones University is, it's, you know, it has its roots in fundamentalist Christianity. It started in the 20s or maybe late, like around 1918 or the 1920s or something like that. But, you know, it started as a reaction against modernism and the, you know, that cultic idea of separating and isolating from, you know, everyone outside of your worldview or belief system. And it, you know, Bob Jones has a very controversial past. They, you know, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but one of their big things that's a big controversy is that they banned interracial dating until 2000, which that's just insane.
Yeah, starting from 20s and then all the way till 2000 to start accepting interracial. Wow.
So that's just like a gist of how really terrible this organization was for so long, and like they're slowly progressing, and that place still has a lot of issues. And I attended Bob Jones University for 3.5 years until I was expelled in January of this year of 2022 from Bob Jones University because I publicly came out with my story, and just because I didn't align with the doctrines, because, you know, Bob Jones in and of itself, it is a cult. And I definitely recognized that once I left, of all the different behaviors and things that went on there. But, you know, that process of leaving, I mean, it was hard because there was so much fear of leaving. There was so much pressure to conform. My parents made it very clear that they, you know, staying in the IFB or in fundamentalist Christianity was what they wanted. They wanted my whole life to still be dedicated to it. Technically still.
Your siblings, are they still in it too, or do they break away?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, my younger brother, he left the IFB, and he's 19. Yeah, he's 19 now. And my older brother, he's turning 25 next week, but he stayed in it, and he's still indoctrinated. He became a youth pastor recently at an IFB cult/church in West Virginia. So it's been interesting. He's one of the few, or really only like second generation who have stayed in it. But, you know, most of my other, you know, cousins, and then like my brother, they've mainly left it. And it was definitely hard, you know, to leave and then have the one sibling stay. But I had to learn and really get over needing or even wanting that acceptance from my parents, because I knew no matter what I did, it still probably wouldn't be enough for them. And if I did, I would just be miserable the rest of my life. And, you know, because of all those years of, you know, all the different trauma, religious trauma, and all the different psychological and emotional abuse, I was really suffering a lot. And even in college, there was still that struggle with depression. And, you know, when I was in college, like I nearly took my own life. And that's really what got me to really take that next step of growth, to finally like claiming my own autonomy. Because for a while, I had definitely questioned a lot of things of like fundamentalism in general, questioning some of the doctrines. But I was so afraid of making my own choices still. There was so much fear around that because I was told I couldn't do that. I didn't have the ability to do that, really. And so learning to say and be brutally honest with myself and be like, you know what? I needed to be in a healthier environment. I need to find community because, you know, Bob Jones University, it had its roots in fundamentalism, and I was still subjected to a lot of spiritual and psychologically abusive sermons again and again. And it was very triggering in the environment, my so many different triggers because of the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so being at Bob Jones, I lived in a state of constant just disassociation, of just being out of my body and, silently struggling with depression and anxiety and being suicidal and all these really repressed emotions, trauma, sexuality, all these things going on that I wasn't quite sure knew how to deal with yet, or what really was going on underneath. But it took me to the point of suicide to really finally claim my own autonomy and be like, you know what, like this is not working anymore. Like this is really emotionally and psychologically hard to do, but like I have to move forward. I have to grow. And so through those 3.5 years of being at Bob Jones University, towards the end of my time there, I deconverted from the religion completely, which is really hard to do. And it took a lot of questioning and really having to break the rules that they told me, or do things they told me I couldn't do, or that finding out that, I met people outside of the cult and they're actually really nice. They're not terrible people like they told me that they were. So it had to like slowly proving that a lot of things that they said weren't true and that they were just trying to keep me scared and inside of the cult and dependent. And it was quite a long process. It took to really just, first questioning their beliefs, understanding some things aren't true, and knowing what are my true values. What do I really believe? What do I really want? And I think that's what was good for me to go to college and really get away from the influence of my parents, because I had to become my own person. And I recognize looking back that I had a very codependent relationship with my mother that I really needed to detach from and really start to become my own person. And there's a lot of complexity to my story, which is why I've been working on a book since I was 19, and right now I'm 22, so it's been like a few years to kind of help process a lot of those things and understanding all the dynamics and the triggers. Because religious trauma is comparable to complex PTSD, which
I was just gonna say that,
yeah, it is. Once I learned about it, it was mind-blowing, because PTSD is when you experience one very big traumatic incident and you have psychological symptoms from that. But complex PTSD is when you experience traumatic events over and over and over again, and it builds and builds and builds and builds. And it makes it really hard to dig into and deal with and understanding and processing. And so a big part of being at Bob Jones, of what really caused me to get kicked out, was I started digging into my religious trauma using photography as an art form. And it was in the fall of 2021, so a year ago, I began creating this photo series, and I published it in January of 2022 of this year. And through the photo series and captions that I wrote on social media, I really told my journey of experiencing religious trauma from this cult and this fundamentalist religion, and just the growth that it took to even begin undoing the indoctrination and walking away and finding a healthy life outside of the cults. And
can we dig into that a little? Because I was going to ask you when I was reading and where it said that loving yourself was one of the most difficult things that you had to do. You felt like you were. Let me just read it. I'll just read it.
Yeah, I got you.
What he's saying. Loving yourself was so difficult. When you felt like one of your closest, or you felt like one of the closest to you, find out that you want to break away, which is unacceptable, and feeling I'm sorry, I lose my train of thought.
It's all good.
I've got dyslexia, so it's hard for me to read a little bit.
No worries.
But so like you didn't have that acceptance, and you was able to find a way to love yourself. So I wanted to ask you, like, how did you find a way to love yourself?
Yeah,
especially with all of that, from the college to the IFB, like I couldn't even imagine. Wow. How did you find yourself?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. It was a long process to do it, and through some of my symptoms, from there was so much self-hatred. And as a result of that self-hatred, my mind began to form really a different identity, because I could not stand the thought of being me, so I had to be someone else. And so that was a psychological issue that resulted of that. So how did I learn to love myself?
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, for me, it was interesting because I haven't dug too much into it in a lot of podcasts. But since this has come up, I will. But I every once in a while, I mentioned that meditation really helps me
That's big. That's big right
deal
there.
with a lot of things. And I secretly meditated from 13 to like 17, and being in that environment, because when I was alone, that's when I didn't have to live in hypervigilance or worry about people judging me or worrying how I was behaving. But I mean, I used it as a way to another way to disassociate, because there were some days I would meditate for like 3 hours a day. It's a lot. That is a lot. And it was because I just needed to mentally escape and feel something. I needed that dopamine, that serotonin, because I wasn't having any of that and anything else. It was just constant stress and cortisol and different stressful things. I was in high alert. My sympathetic nervous system was always on high alert. And so learning to love myself, yeah, that was like really hard, because I had obviously had very terrible low self-esteem at a lot of my teen years. But what it took to do that was to overcome that belief that I did not have worth. And this is actually something I've never dug into, which is, I think it's great when I can finally dig into some things in podcast when
Making
questions
history.
come up. Yes. But Lisa Nichols was a big part. And for those who don't know her, Lisa Nichols is a motivational speaker. And if you have not seen her work, go search her on YouTube. And she's still very active on social media. She's done a lot of talks for Mind Valley, which is like they're big about meditation and mindfulness. But she's also an author, and she has an incredible story herself with how she overcame her life circumstances. But really looking back, Lisa Nichols was like the mother that I really needed, the person that validated me, that told me I had worth, that told me I had potential. And she really helped me see the potential in myself. No one else believed in me. But she taught me that I didn't need that I could believe in myself because of her story. She experienced a lot of people, like no one in her life supported her. A lot of people told her she would be nothing. People told her to never speak in public ever, that she was a terrible public speaker, but yet she's one of the top public speakers in the world.
Mm.
And it's because she believed in herself and she pushed herself to become the person that she wanted. So learning to deconstruct that idea that I don't have potential, that I don't have worth, that was something that I did in my teen years through Lisa Nichols, of, deprogramming of, what, I'm constantly getting this negative messaging all the time, but I'm going to decide to put positive messaging secretly into my mind, because psychologically, I need this. I need this from my parents, but I'm not getting this from my parents. So I need this through this avenue. And so personal growth and focusing on human potential for myself was really, it started as, looking back, I didn't know what it was, but really it's kind of, in a sense, I was kind of doing like cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's when you challenge the thoughts that you have. So if a thought tells you you're worthless, you say, why am I worthless? Is there proof that I'm worthless? Or is there proof that I have worth? It's challenging those thoughts that you have. And meditation really helped me do that, because it makes you aware of what's going on in your mind. And affirmations were a big part of undoing, and I'm still undoing, that negative beliefs about myself and that self-hatred of listening to these affirmations that, oh, you are worthy, you are loved. And it was so refreshing to my soul to hear that over and over again, because I never got any of that. So those years of secretly having affirmations and building that self-worth on my own, and it really didn't, my self-esteem didn't really greatly build until really my college years, when I became more independent and I decided to really, I think it was like an hour before bed. I'm like, an hour I will listen to affirmations. Even while I was asleep, I'll listen to affirmations. So unconsciously, this can still have an effect. And it was crazy to me of like, after like at college for like 30 days in a row of an hour of night listening to affirmations and believing them, how much my mood was shift in that month and continuing it. And just trying to undo that, reprogramming my mind. And so meditation was a big part, and it was natural to me because I am an INFJ, which just it means I'm a very compassionate, empathetic person. I'm very purpose driven. I'm very motivated by personal growth, and so that's very natural to me. And so through my own personal growth, through meditation, affirmations, listening to public speakers, and challenging my thoughts and proving to myself that the things that people said about me or my humanity wasn't true, helps me to get over the impact of it. Now, of course, there are things, that still affect me to some degree. I've been in therapy for almost a year now, dealing with religious trauma and the upbringing that I went through, and I'll be in it for many years more, and still dealing with triggers that happen. But it was learning to really be my own hero. I mean, I think that's kind of like the message of my story when I talk to people. Like, I learned to become my own hero. There was no one in my life that was my own hero at all. And so, and that's really what I love when I tell my story, because a lot of it is really sad, and depressing and discouraging, but there is like a positive message at the end that you can become your own hero. You can become the writer of your own story. It is your life. And so to me, like metaphorically, when I walked away from that religion, it was just really me claiming my autonomy, because that was everything my parents wanted. It wasn't what I wanted. They were creating me into the image that they wanted. I didn't want to be indoctrinated in this system. I didn't want to grow up in this cult. I didn't want anything to do with fundamentalist Christianity, but I conformed to be loved and accepted. But walking away from that was so powerful, of saying, you know what? I know what's best for me, and it's taken me years to get to this point, and I still have to work through a lot of things in therapy, because trauma, it affects every aspect of your life. It affects your perception of yourself, of the world. It affects your relationships and your ability to function. And so therapy has been really great to dig into that and to help me continue be on that journey of healing, and personal growth. And learning on my own what religion recovery is looking like for me, and really experiencing all of that really pushed me to decide to become a therapist and eventually a psychologist, because I want to help people with religious trauma, and I also want to research religious trauma as a psychologist to fill in the gaps, because there needs to be so much more research and like how to actually help people with religious trauma. And I recently became a religion recovery coach, helping people grapple with life after religion, because that's really hard, because you're looking for a purpose, you're looking for a new community, you're looking.
Congratulations on that too. I did see.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, and so for me, part of my healing now is has been, sharing my story and being vocal about what I went through, how I overcame it, and what I learned from it, and what I'm still learning, and talking about how I'm still growing and what I plan to do. I really like turning my pain into purpose, really. And I'm really excited because I recently this year finished the first draft of my book. It's close to 60,000 words. I'm working on the second draft now, and it's just been incredibly healing. And I hope through the book, it's a memoir, but it's a little different because I incorporate psychology into it, and label with psychological terms things that I went through and what it means, and the underlying things that went on, because I think it will help other people process their own religious trauma and growing up in that. Now, not that like every situation is like black and white, but I think people can see their own story and mine and help. They can take whatever they can, and just kind of learn from that and realize, you know what, I can be my own hero. I can claim autonomy. I can find a healthy life. There's not one way to live a healthy life, and just understand that you are your own hero.
When can all my peeps, that's all my audience, my peeps and new audience could probably expect your book to come out?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think it's going to be something I'm going to sit on for a while, because I think I have so much more growth to work on, and things to process in therapy. So, like, right now I'm 22, so I'm hoping at the latest it will come out by the time I'm 30, but maybe it might be early. It might be a few years earlier. Who knows? I'm not sure, but
say 25.
we'll see. I don't know.
No pressure.
But no, I got you. But I definitely want to take my time with it and not like, because there have been times when I've could not write for months because it was too much to process. Or when you're writing your story and writing about trauma, you're reliving it. And it's been nice to see the growth as I've gone back and as I finished the first draft and how I review it, and how there are certain things that don't trigger me as much anymore, and seeing that, oh my gosh, like I am growing. Some of these triggers are starting to go away. I still have some more work in other areas, but I think I don't want to rush the publication of it, because I think it's so personal and it's so important to me that I want to love every single word in the book. The title of my book, which I had several titles, and like it wasn't until I finished the first draft that I decided on it, because I'm like seeing what the book, the message was. But I decided to call the book Suffering in Silence, Surviving and Healing Religious Trauma. And like kind of like the tagline is, a story of growing up in a Christian cult. But as I read the book, or the first draft, I'm like, I saw this common thing of just suffering in silence a lot, suffering and struggling with things alone. But I think, I've been working kind of on typing out the description of my book, because I think what's powerful is that I suffered in silence for so many years. But I think through the growth that I had, I finally learned to speak up. And that's why I decided to really call my podcast that, Speaking Out with Andrew Pledger, because that's really what I did when I finally told my stories. For years I suffered in silence, but I finally found the courage to speak up, tell my story and about what I experienced and how I could help other people, and trying to help other people with my story. And so, there are a lot of themes in the book. It's really like a thing that I'm seeing now is kind of like the idea of being the cycle breaker, breaking that generational trauma, stopping those cycles of abuse, really being the one to stop that, becoming your own hero, claiming your own autonomy. And it's a journey of identity and coming of age. There are different things involved. I think, even if people didn't grow up in that kind of situation, I think there are things that people will connect with a lot in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't grow up with any of that, and I can already connect, just from the stuff that you were talking about, from, mental health to depression and finding your identity, finding yourself.
Yes.
So I'm real excited for you, Andrew, that when this book comes out, and I know it's going to be a masterpiece, and I'll make sure that, all my peeps, no problem, and all my peeps, and, of course, me will definitely support it and push it out there as much as possible.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
I just got a couple more questions. That I love asking all my guests is quotes. I'm a big quote guy, or that you grew up or that you love to lean on with. So my question is, what is your favorite quote or saying that you lean on during the good times or the bad times?
Yeah, interesting. Like there were so many positive messages I tried to instill on myself, and I'm trying to think of quotes by Lisa Nichols, because she was the one that inspired me so much. And I think one of the things that she said is that you are the writer of your own story. I think that's the idea that I kind of got from you. you hold the power of your life, really. And yes, like easier said than done. I got expelled and really excommunicated from Bob Jones, and I lost a lot of friends because I decided to become the writer of my own story. But it's worked out for the best because a lot of people in my life that didn't need to be there or weren't healthy were gone. And really just learning that I really do deserve better. I do deserve better. I deserve to be in a healthy environment, to have healthy relationships. So I think the quote is just, you are the writer of your story.
Love it. I love that. And for all my peeps in the audience, where can they find you on social media or your website? I could put it into the video and description.
Yeah. So I'm very active on a lot of social media platforms. My Instagram is my main one, but I'm active on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and I have my link tree in every profile where you can find different things about me. So I'll send you my link tree so you can link that. So people, I have links in my link tree to my photo series, to my story, and to the interview also that got me expelled from Bob Jones, if people are interested in that too.
Definitely. And I'll definitely make sure I put that in the video description for all my peeps. So my last question is gratitude. Like, it's been a crazy year for me. So what's been keeping me grounded is gratitude. And I was just speaking with you, and you opened up about your life. I mean, it's been a crazy life, but at least it's on the up and up, and it's turning around.
Yes.
So
yes,
definitely. So what are 3 things that you're grateful for in your life?
Yeah. So like, I would say I am so grateful for people who offer unconditional love and support. And that was something that I discovered while I was at Bob Jones. I was able to escape and move in with a family that really took me under their wing while I was at Bob Jones to help me cope. And like, since being expelled, that's how I was able to escape. So I'm so grateful for people. The people that I was told were supposed to be the most awful have been the most loving and wonderful. So I'm grateful for people who have unconditional love and support. And I think a second thing I'm grateful for is really the opportunity. I'm grateful for really knowing my own purpose and having that, using my pain for purpose. Turning the darkness into light, per se, I guess you would say. And another thing is that I'm so grateful for other people too, like you, who are giving a platform for people to share their stories. I think it's so important, and I've seen the difference that it can make in people's lives on my own podcast. For people, it's so empowering to share your own story, and it can inspire other people. So I'm grateful for all the different platforms that people offer.
Thank you, Andrew, for coming on the People's Choice podcast, for sharing your story. We went through crazy ride from the down to the ups to the middle to a bright future, and you got the support from me and all my peeps. Thank you again. Just any one last message that you would love to just give to maybe someone out there on a positive note?
I would say anyone who is either stuck in a toxic religion or toxic, harmful situation where they feel manipulated into that, there are resources out there and people out there who will love and accept you for who you are, and just not every situation is black and white. So making decisions that are the healthiest for you according to your situation, and that you do have worth, and you don't need anyone to validate that but yourself as a person, that you do have worth.
Definitely. Andrew Pledger, ladies and
gentlemen. Thank you for having me, Alvin.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for coming, and
of course,
shining your light onto the podcast, and shining light to bring awareness to this. I think it's going to open up a lot of people's eyes that see this, and realizing that, man, there's people out here that suffer. They don't even realize it just yet.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Andrew, for being on the show.
Yes, of course.
And we are out, ladies and gentlemen.